Is there any specific advice that you would give to lifters that have been in the iron game for that long?
I don't think that there's some secret sauce hidden in the ivory tower, but I think it's worth really making sure is the case. Ensuring that all of the musculature you want to grow is actually being targeted appropriately. I think those things are just going to ensure that you still move in the right direction. And then you also just need to accept that progress is going to be slower. It just kind of is what it is, but it can add up.
Okay, Josh. So good question from Carl here. Carl asked, let's say we're talking about hypertrophy for lifters who've been lifting for 10 years. So these lifters have been in the game for a while. They've got callus on their hands, definitely started to experience the diminishing returns in terms of, seeing actual progress in the mirror and maybe even in their lifts. Is there any specific advice that you would give to lifters that have been in the iron game for that long that would allow them to continue progress? Maybe, anything just related to that journey to continue having, additional fruitful years of training?
Yeah, that's a great question. And where my mind initially goes is I always like to ask the question of has it been 10 good years? I think baked into this question is that it has been 10 good years.
Yeah.
But I do think it's worth starting there because I think some people might be like, oh, I've been training for, even if it's 5 years, right? I'm past the noob phase, or I've been training for 10 years. I'm even past the intermediate phase. I often find that's not always the case. And there's a lot of juice to still squeeze out of their training career. So I would start off on an optimistic note that I think some people are less advanced than they think. And the next point that I'll make, I think, can also lead to a lot of optimism, is that I don't think the principles change all that much. I don't think someone's been hiding the secret recipe for gains after year 10 and, it's behind a paywall somewhere. I think a lot of the principles we talk about on this show, or you find from other, credible or people talking exercise science or hypertrophy training, whether it's evidence-based or not evidence-based. I think a lot of those principles that are kind of common across folks, they're going to apply. And I think that can lead to a lot of optimism such that you just need to kind of get better at applying those principles is the way that I think about it. And we could, of course, dive into those principles a little bit more, but there's a reason we have full podcast episodes that are often multiple hours long, is how we arrive at those principles and how to interpret those principles. But I don't think that there's some secret sauce that's, kind of been hidden in the ivory tower or in some, I don't know, some locker room at an LA Fitness that that no one's willing to reveal to you. But like I said, I think you do need to get better at applying the principles. And there's two things that come to mind for me in terms of principles that can be applied better in a lot of these cases. The first is ensuring that training is specific. And that might kind of be like an underwhelming answer, but I think it's worth really making sure is the case. Our company, Data Driven Strength, we often have a lot of clientele that are interested in strength development. We also have a lot of clientele that are interested in strength development, work with us for a few years, and they're like, hey, I'm kind of interested in giving this hypertrophy thing a shot. So pretty common for those things to kind of shift. And maybe they have been doing some hypertrophy training for a while alongside their strength goals, and maybe they have been training for 10 plus years, but they haven't really been doing 10 plus years of very specific targeted hypertrophy training. So there might be a time when you are advanced enough where it does make sense to become more specific and more targeted towards hypertrophy if you had concurrent goals before. Now, let me add a very clear caveat here that I don't think if you still want to have some strength goals or you still get fired up about increasing your powerlifting total, that you can't continue to see very robust hypertrophy gains. But at least being cognizant of that sliding scale of, very concurrent goals. Maybe I have some endurance goals, some strength goals alongside my hypertrophy goals, right? Versus the other side of the scale where it's all hypertrophy. You might need to slide that scale a little bit. And the degree to which you slide that scale might depend on your level of advancement. Alongside that more specific and targeted recommendation I'm giving, I think being very specific and targeted with exercise selection just becomes more and more important. We've had some content recently that's like a tier list of things that drive hypertrophy outcomes or the variables that are most important for hypertrophy outcomes. And I think number one was exercise selection / exercise execution. So again, the principle here is the same. I think that's true for a beginner or an intermediate. I think it's also true for an advanced person. But just making sure those are very specific and very targeted is just more and more important and can be the difference between spinning your wheels for a couple years in the advanced status versus seeing meaningful progress. So that might mean ensuring that all of the musculature you want to grow is actually being targeted appropriately, right? Maybe just doing like a powerlifting program might have some back work, right? But maybe it's just 4 sets of rows on Monday and 4 sets of rows on Thursday. You might need a little bit more specificity. You might need a little bit more targeted training, depending on the exact row you're doing, to target the lats a little bit better, right? So you might need some vertical pulls. You might need some different attachments that influence your the exact way that you're gripping the implement, and therefore your elbow angle, and therefore where in the back musculature, you know, the stimulus is going. To drop a little personal anecdote in here, is I started actually doing some pullover training. I'm also cutting right now, and granted, there's some
helping the detail come in.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's and long story short, I feel like I am noticing some slight visual improvements in terms of
like newbie gains almost.
Yeah, like some newbie gains. So I think that can apply for someone that is advanced. Is there
Exactly.
probably tissues that are less advanced and you can kind of get some newbie gains, right? Maybe you've only done flat pressing for a while and you're like, man, things are really slowing down. You should maintain some flat pressing, right? But if you add some other pressing angles, you might kind of get some newbie gains there, and that can be a way to continue to move in the right direction. So that's the first recommendation I would have is, or I guess the second one. The first one is the principles are still the principles and don't feel like something is being hidden from you. The second one is ensure that specificity is high and ensure that exercise selection and execution is very targeted. The last thing I'll say, again, this applies to all training statuses, but I think it just becomes more important. And in a way, the window becomes smaller in terms of like what you can get away with and still progress as you become more advanced. And that is appropriate execution of whatever nutritional phase that you're in. Let me caveat this by saying I don't think that you can't make gains as an advanced person in a maintenance period. But even if you are in a maintenance period, you shouldn't accidentally lose 4 pounds in 2 weeks because you forgot to eat, right? You shouldn't, if your goal is to bulk, and a good ballpark for rates of gain is about 0.5% to 1% of your body weight per month. If that's your goal and you weigh 200 pounds, quick math, your goal is to gain 1 to 2 pounds per month. I think that's a pretty good recommendation. Nice, slow, steady rates of gain. If that's your goal, and then you accidentally gain 5 pounds in a month, next thing you know, you have to spend more total time in the calendar year or whatever cutting, which again, you can probably still make some muscle growth progress when cutting given certain parameters, or at least maintain, but you're taking away from time in a surplus that is probably at least a little bit better for muscle growth. Same idea if you're cutting. A good recommendation here for folks on the advanced side, and this is a pretty wide range just because there's so many different variables here, depending how long you've been in the cut, what your current body composition is, but a pretty wide range here would be 0.33 to 1% of your body weight per week is a good target rate of weight loss when cutting. If that's your goal, but you accidentally spend 5 months where you lose only 1 pound total, but the goal was to get that body fat off to get back into a bulk, it's just going to be harder to get away with those things, right? I don't think that's wasted time. I don't think you're going to make no progress, but the progress could just be so slow that you poke your head up after year 12 of training, right? So 2 years later, you're like, man, I'm just not all that pleased with results. I can't really detect any results. Whereas I think if you keep the principles in mind, you just execute those principles very well. And again, the two that I'm highlighting here is just specificity of training and appropriate execution of whatever the target rate of gain and loss is. I think those things are just going to ensure that you still move in the right direction. And then you also just need to accept that progress is going to be slower. It just kind of is what it is, but it can add up. And I think there are plenty of examples of people that are very well trained and maybe even quote unquote old, right? And a lot of people kind of get in there, they start thinking kind of the things are stacked against them. But there's plenty of examples of people that are well trained, deep into their training career, that continue to make detectable progress so long as they adhere to those things I mentioned.